Key concept 1.3 deals with the development and interactions of early agricultural, pastoral, and urban societies. We're really going to talk about civilization a little bit more here and how it gave way to some of these empires. Uh, we've already mentioned the River Valley civilizations and where they developed. Yellow River Valley, Mohenjo-Daro, and Harappan civilization, Mesopotamia, Egyptian here on the Nile, the Chabin, and Teotihuacan civilization here in Mesoamerica. We're going to go a little bit more in depth. Let's talk first about Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is located between the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. Mesopotamia, if you break the word down, means land between the rivers. Okay, and named Fertile Crescent, if you look at this shape here, it does look kind of like a crescent. This is where it developed. Many people say this is even where agriculture first developed, the domestication of certain fauna or plants. One of the first civilizations to develop there was the Sumerian civilization. But before that, you had the beginning of city-states, individual cities. We talked about with the Neolithic Revolution, excess food led to excess population. People settled down in one place. This led to the rise of cities. And some of these first cities, you kind of need to know or be familiar with the names of Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, and then the people that talk too much, the Babylonians. They babble on and on and on. When we talk about empires, what happened is that people consolidated these cities into one group, one ruler, one culture, one religion. And these locations in these empires are going to change all throughout ancient history. Some of them, how they changed, what they did, how they interacted with other groups is what we're really going to focus on. But that's the Fertile Crescent about 2500 BCE. Later, it would give rise to the Assyrian Empire in 650 BC, and you could see how it spread the Assyrians all the way from Mesopotamia down through Palestine, Phoenicia, and then in Egypt. Okay. Egypt in the Nile River Valley. Geography plays a huge role here. Mesopotamia, you had land between the rivers, but here it's all in Egypt about the Nile River. If you look at the geography surrounding Egypt in the Nile River, you'll see that it's desert, an eastern and western desert. So their dependence on the water from the Nile is unbelievable. Nile River is unique, that it flows in the opposite direction of what you might think. Okay, the Nile River flows from here northward. There are only two rivers that flow north from the equator, and that's the Nile River in Egypt and the St. Johns River here in Florida. And remind me to tell you about a joke about why the St. Johns River flows north. The Egyptian Empire developed over time. It was a dynasty. It was passed down from one ruler to the other for generations. You could see here that the Egyptian Empire eventually spread into what is today Palestine, into Syria. It had contact with the Hittites. The Hittites, as we know, were developers of the chariot and iron and very, very warrior-like people. And if you look at this map also, you'll see that there were trade routes. Okay, these empires, especially in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, they did come in contact with one another, and trade was crucial. Okay, trade was very, very important to these people. Trade over a long distance, the relationships they built up between one empire and the other was very important, very, very important. The Kush Empire later developed. Nubia was a big trading partner of Egypt. Why trade? It's simple. You have something I don't have. I want it. Let's swap something out for that object, whatever it is. It could be food, it could be mineral, it could be metal, but trade did exist back then, especially between these different empires. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the Indus River Valley. Let's focus on them for a second. Now, geography also plays a very, very prominent part in India. When you talk about South Asia, it's about the monsoons. Okay, there's the dry monsoon winds from October to May, the wet monsoon winds from June to September, and as you could see coming off the Himalayan mountains, that's the dry period. But then from June to September, coming off the Arabian Sea, that is the wet period, and we're talking about raining every day. So that geography and the monsoons play a crucial role in the development of India because of water. Okay, water. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, along the Indus River Valley here. Once again, all river valley civilizations were subject to flooding. These civilizations, we think, were decimated by earthquakes and flooding. What's also interesting about them is the writing. We, to this day, have not been able to decipher what their writing was, and writing is one of the key components of civilization. The Shang and the Yellow River or Huanghe Valley. The Shang were the first empire of China. The Huanghe or Yellow River is named because of the color of its silt. The silt is part of the overflow. The yellow silt here from the Huanghe is a distinctive color, but that silt is also very rich in nutrients and led to the development of the Shang dynasty in China, one of the first there. In Mesoamerica, in this part of the world, you have the Olmecs. Okay, the Olmecs were here near the Bay of Campeche, in today what is part of Central America. They developed a civilization on their own, pretty unique. Certain games they had, kind of like basketball. This was a solid rubber ball that they would kick, not throw, through this hoop here at the top. They had to kick it through. What was interesting about this early version of basketball is this game was played to the death. The winners were celebrated as heroes and the losers were usually sacrificed, but it's a pretty interesting game. The Chabin, and that's V pronounced with the letter B, established powerful and religious worship centers here in the Andean regions of today Peru. They were very influential in their artistic styles. They also were able to domesticate the llama and the alpaca that they used as their beast of burden to transport items in this mountainous region. Their way of burial was pretty unique, that you could tell a lot about them the way they buried their dead, what they buried them with, food, weapons, and so forth. And ancestor veneration is a term we're going to use frequently throughout this course. Ancestor veneration was very important to the Chabin. They literally would mummify their relatives, their dead family, and they would keep them in burial sites that you see here at the bottom, which were very sacred places to them. They would pray to them and go to them and talk to them on many occasions, asking for advice, and in many instances we found that the Chabin would also keep their ancestors in the home with them. Yeah, that's right. You know, Grandma, should I ask this girl out? Should we get married? You know, literally they're asking Grandma sitting in the corner of the house. Grandma was still there and mummified, so they placed a big importance on ancestor veneration. You see here that in relation to one another, the Olmec near San Lorenzo in the Bay of Campeche. Later on, the Zapotec here, the Chabin in the purple, later on the Nazca, and then in yellow the Moche. But these civilizations developed in Meso and South America around 1200 BC to 700 AD. When you look and you compare them, you can see that once again, making the transition from the Neolithic Revolution, small groups, civilizations emerged, steady supply of agriculture, all the different components of civilization were there, organization and structure were there. The Chabin established powerful religious worship centers, very influential in their art. The Nazca and Moche developed irrigation for farming, intricate ceramics and textiles. The Olmec, sorry guys, jumpy mouse. In Mesoamerica, so we're talking Mexico and Central America. Where is my mouse? There we go. Designed and built pyramids, plazas, monumental sculptures. We'll talk more about monumental architecture in many of these cultures. Ceremonial centers, ritual ball games, that version of basketball to the death, and large trade networks. Once again, trade between these empires was important. You have something I don't, let's trade for it. The Zapotec built magnificent urban center in Monte Alban, a huge city. Some of these cities built in Mesoamerica were larger than any other place in the world at the time. We're talking literally 100,000 people or more in some of these places. And they developed early forms of hieroglyphic writing and the calendars. And we'll talk later about the famous Mayan calendar. Oh yeah, it ran out. The first states. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about what a state is and its importance in politics. The definition and characteristic of a state is one, many of these early states, the rulers had divine support. Now think about this. If you're a ruler and you're large and you're in charge, why not say that the gods want you in charge? Nobody's going to question you then. If you're there by heavenly authority, then by God, they better support you or suffer the consequences. And the second thing many of these state rulers had is they were supported by the military. Obviously, these are patriarchal. They are dominated by men. As states grew and competed for land and resources, the more favorably situated, like the Hittites, who had access to iron, had greater access to resources, they produced more food, and they experienced growing populations. Now, there is a competition as people grow, as population increases, they are competing for supplies. States and cities competed for supplies to support their growing populations. These states were able to undertake territorial expansion and conquer surrounding states. They went on the look to take what they needed to survive, and if that meant militarily taking it from somebody else, they did that. Early regions of state expansion or empire building were in Mesopotamia. We mentioned some of those, the Chabin, the Olmec, Babylonia with the Sumerians, the Akkadians. These names you should just be familiar with. The Babylonians, and in the Nile Valley with Nubia, Egypt, and then Kush. Pastoralists were often the developers and disseminators of new weapons and modes of transportation that transformed warfare in agrarian civilizations. Once again, go back to those pastoralists. They move from place to place, and with them they take new technology, new weapons made out of iron, not bronze, and things like the wheel, the chariot, and so forth. And those were powerful, powerful weapons in the hands of the motivated few. Culture played a significant role in unifying states through laws, language, literature, religion, myths, and monumental art. So let's take a little look here at culture. Monumental architecture and urban planning. You're going to see in many of these civilizations, urban planning existed. When they built cities, they planned them. It's not just haphazard. You run into a lot of problems there. Monumental architecture, which took literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people building and building and building to build some of these things. You see evidence here. This is the Druids or the Celts, at Stonehenge. Harappans, one of the first river valley civilizations in the Indus River, had plumbing. And if you look closely at this diagram, you'll see that they had a sewer system. I mean, this was very advanced for the time. These cities contained a lot of people living in close proximity. One of the effects of that is disease, runoff. What are you going to do with your sewage if you have 50, 60,000 people living in close proximity? The Harappans had plumbing. They had a very good plumbing system. They had communal baths with fresh water that was brought in that they used. They were very good at this. Now, like I said earlier, we don't know much about their civilization. It kind of disappeared, we think, because of flooding, maybe an earthquake, a tsunami, and their language we still haven't been able to decode. The Tower of Babel by the Babylonians. You read about this even in the Bible. This was a monumental structure. Nobody's quite sure how big or how extravagant it was, but obviously something of this scope takes a lot of work and a lot of cooperation. In Mesopotamian society, you have what is called a ziggurat, and it's a temple, and it kind of looks like a pyramid. What's very interesting is these were where religious leaders stayed, where the priests stayed. Religion was centered there, but it was also a seat for government. Shang architecture in the river valley in China was very monumental in some of the cities they built. Quite elaborate, quite big, quite the scale. Monumental architecture again. And then, of course, Egyptians with their pyramids. Monumental architecture, okay, and be able to recite some of the examples of these and where and when. In Mesoamerica, you have the Olmec, and what's really interesting about them is that their temples and their pyramids, think of the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, your pyramids in Egypt, and these pyramids here in Mesoamerica, they're all pretty much alike. They are very unique, and these societies developed independently of one another. One other interesting thing about the Olmec are the giant heads. A lot of controversy surrounding them. There's actually a myth out there that These facial features of the giant Olmec heads are African in nature. If you look at the nostrils, the lips, and the facial features, some people say, oh, this is kind of African. Maybe somebody came over from Africa to this area. Very debatable, but that is one theory that is out there. Here you see a couple other of these Olmec heads, and some people interpret, oh, there's some African facial features there. I'll leave that up to you to be the judge. But once again, cooperation to get the stone, carve the stone, move the stone, build the pyramids took the work of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Very elaborate. I'm always going to say this wrong, but Teotihuacan people of central Mexico built a city literally on a lake. Monumental architecture, pyramids, plazas. These were big cities. Okay, you see the Chabin Temple here. This is a diagram of what it looked like in the Andes, but it was big. Okay, this is no small feat. Monumental architecture once again. Elites promoted arts and artisanship. Because civilization people specialize in things, they have extra time. They can focus on one thing, and one of them is the arts and architecture. Sculptures, weavings. You have, this is from Harappan society, these two sculptures here. This is Shang, China. Obviously Egypt, the Olmecs here, and this is ancient Sumerian right there. Systems of record keeping or writing. This developed with surplus food. You have to keep track of how much food you have and who's getting it and doling it out. So priests were the first people, or scribes, to develop systems of writing and record keeping. They arose independently in every civilization except Papua New Guinea. That's the only one where we don't have writing from. And then from there, these systems of writing diffuse through pastoralists, through trade. You have cuneiform. Cuneiform is a form of writing developed in ancient Sumer. You have hieroglyphics in Egypt. And then the quipu, the Incans used. And this is a system of tying knots at different intervals and different styles that is a system of record keeping. Legal codes, another form of civilization. States developed legal codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, that reflected existing hierarchies and facilitated the rule of government over people. Legal code is simply, or you'll hear the phrase codification, putting it in writing. The Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a Babylonian emperor who put these in stone, carved in stone, and these stones were transported throughout the empire so people could know exactly what the law was. One of the famous things we get from the Code of Hammurabi is the old eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Here you see the stone that was used, and this is what it looked like. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. The old eye for an eye. If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. Tooth for a tooth. If he break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. Now, while this sounds good, and the content of this law, the base of this law was transported throughout history to other laws, it was not applied equally to everybody. Remember, there are social hierarchies, there are social structures. The punishment for men and women was a little bit different, but still, it's codified, it's written down. That means everybody can see it, everybody knows what it is. We see new religious beliefs emerge during this period of history. They developed in this period. They continued to have strong influences in later periods. In world history, we're going to talk a lot about religion and how it changed and how it migrated, how it diffused, and how it's blended. Three things at this period of time I want you to pay attention to were the Vedic religion. The Vedic religion was brought to what is current-day India, the Harappan Mohenjo-daro area of the Indus Valley, by Aryans. These are people that migrated in from Central Eurasia. You have the Hebrews in monotheism. As you know, monotheism is a belief in one God and not many gods. That's polytheistic. And then Zoroastrianism, which is also monotheistic. This developed in today what you would consider Persia, Iran. And these three religious beliefs were new and kind of unique and paved the way for other religions down the road. As I mentioned, the Aryans were a group of people, nomadic, pastoralists, but they invaded India, for anywhere between 1500 and 250 BCE. They implanted their religious beliefs, their Vedic religions. They instituted the caste system that would dominate India for a long, long time to come. And they took over Indian society and blended theirs with the indigenous people. Here you see the Middle East sometimes. Whoa, sorry. Once again, my bad. Canaan, sometimes referred to as Palestine. The Hebrew people between Egypt and Canaan and Jerusalem and this area move back and forth. You see the kingdom of Israel here in blue, the kingdom of Judah. This was around 922 BCE. Babylon, Mesopotamia, this kind of goes into the history of the Hebrew people, the Jewish faith, and we'll talk more in depth about that a little bit later. Trade expanded between these groups, between these empires. Trade expanded throughout this period from local to regional. That means from one city to another city's local, regional, from this part of Egypt to another part of Egypt, and trans-regional, which means from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Okay, with civilizations exchanging goods, cultural ideas, and technology. I want you to really focus on the trade between Egypt and Nubia. That would be considered regional. And between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, that would be trans-regional. The ancient world about 1500 BCE, this is what it would look like in this part of the world as far as trade goes. You had the Indo-Europeans, here's the mouse, the Indo-Europeans who would come into India and migrate this way. The Hittite Empire, remember the Hittites, iron, okay, very, very, very important thing. Chariots, very powerful warriors who would conquer Egypt and the Middle East. The Phoenicians, which we'll talk about a little bit later, were famous sailors who went all throughout the Mediterranean, and these were the different trade routes that existed even back then. So when we talk about trans-regional and regional trade, there were people traveling great distances for goods. This led to the exchange of goods, religion, language, ideas, and so on. Ancient Egypt and Nubia. The Egyptian and Nubian societies developed along the Nile River. Egypt traded with and sometimes controlled the peoples of the Levant on the eastern Mediterranean coast. Nubian people were very, very dark-skinned, very, very black, I guess you want to say, compared to the people of Egypt. And remember, the Nile River flowed in this direction towards the Mediterranean. You have Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt. It's kind of upside down, but that's because that's the way the Nile flows. And then the kingdom of Nubia and Kush down here. And they had different things that Egyptians wanted, people here in the Middle East wanted, and a lot of trade took place. This picture here talks about the Bronze Age, and anytime you hear the term the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, it's real simple. That was the metal that was being used by most people at that time. So during the Bronze Age, they were using bronze. And these are some of the boats that they were using in the Indian Ocean at that time, and just shows you how they were made, how they traded, how big they were, a little bit about the scale, and how they went through the Gulf of Oman, and we're talking here from the Middle East into Harappa, into India, following those seasonal monsoon winds. And just, you could study this at your own leisure. Once again, another map showing trade through the Arabian Peninsula, the city-state of Ur. Here you have Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Persian Gulf, all the way to India here. You see the Indus Valley River civilization. What was being traded? Well, gold, silver, carnelian, lapis, copper, alabaster, steatite, bitumen, and shell. And do I know what all those are? But you can look. Social and gender hierarchies intensified. Egalitarian society went further out the window. Patriarchal society became more of the dominant thing. Social and gender hierarchies intensified as states expanded and cities multiplied. Literature. Let's talk a little bit about that. Each of these civilizations developed some epic literature that survives to this day. The Egyptians with the Book of the Dead, the Holy Vedas, the Rig Veda, and so forth in India, and then the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia.